Right, thanks, Jim. We heard, I think, yesterday rumours about somewhere called the south of England, where some of the frequent species there, some of the rarer ones in the central belt of Scotland. And I'd like to take you there now, to Cambridge, which is, as you'll see here, in one of the warmer parts of Britain and certainly in the driest part. And Cambridge has a curious history of growth in that until the early 19th century, it was surrounded completely by open agricultural fields managed in the medieval way, and development was completely prohibited in this common land. And so the Georgian town became increasingly crowded, increasingly insanitary. And it wasn't until enclosure of the common fields in the early 19th century allowed residential areas to expand onto the surrounding land. And the streets I'm talking about are largely those that were developed in the 19th century as part of this residential expansion. And so they're outside the historic centre of the town, but only a rather brief walk into it. And my talk's based on two studies. I'm starting with a survey of the plants flowering in the streets around my house, which I've carried out monthly since January 2016. And then I'm going on to describe the interim results of another survey in which I've been repeating a study of another group of streets first carried out by my friend Philip Oswald in 1998-1999, and which I've been resurveying this year. So my first study is a transect of 8 streets in which I started in January 2016 as part of the New Year plant hunt, and I've continued it monthly ever since, because it struck me that we were gathering an awful lot of information about what was flowering in New Year, but we knew rather little about what was flowering for the rest of the year in any systematic way. And I list the plants flowering in each of these 8 streets, each street individually, at the start of each month. I include only the roads and the roadsides, the publicly accessible areas, and the streets I cover vary from the simple streets at the bottom right, such as Albert Street with houses coming directly onto the road, to the much more complicated, what I call a roundabout, and the council calls a gyratory system here, and with lawns and flower beds, etc. And I do note the habitats, as you do for the urban studies, in which the flowering plants are found, pavements, walls, verges, etc. Now, those of you with a statistical bent may dismiss this exercise as a study based on a sample size of 1, and therefore telling you nothing that can be generalized beyond the 8 streets of the survey. And you'd have a point, and I'm perhaps fortunate in retirement that I don't have to subject my research proposals to critical scrutiny. But there are, I would say, compensations for a study in which you're walking one transect again and again, rather than, as so often in modern recording, visiting singly visits a whole range of different sites. And the most obvious, of course, is you can build up a time sequence of data, but there's also the much less tangible benefits of getting to know what's going on in detail, of watching the results of all the factors that are affecting the flora, such as climatic extremes, the managements of the streets by the council, the varied treatment of their frontages by corporate landowners and individuals, and even the longevity and persistence and fate of individual plants. And this wild strawberry became something of a landmark for me, as it persisted for 5 years on this wall of Magdalen College until it was officiously rooted out one spring, to my great sadness. I don't want to say much about the phenology of the flora, because I've written about this elsewhere, but there's a clear annual sequence. The number of flowering species increases rapidly in the spring to a maximum in June or July, and then decreases much more gradually to a minimum in February or more rarely in March. And there's a clear relationship shown here between the number of plants flowering in the winter months and the temperature. Here I've plotted it against the mean minimum temperature, but clearly that's correlated with all sorts of other factors like the absolute minimum temperature for the preceding month. Similarly, it's clear, at least to me, that in drought years, and we've had two very severe droughts in my 6-year period, in my 8-year period, that the number of plants in the high summer is reduced compared to what it is in a normal year. And I'd, despite John's warnings yesterday, would have the temerity to assert that this is cause and effect, and that we are showing a reduction in the very dry years. The third significant factor, which Michael mentioned, is weed killing. And until this year, the council has applied weed killer to the streets in late spring or early summer. Now, you realise that a corporate weed killing as you walk along the streets isn't that efficient. Areas behind parked bikes, which there are a lot in Cambridge, or under parked cars are ignored. Walls aren't sprayed, private areas leading off from the streets aren't sprayed. But nevertheless, the weed killing clearly reduces the number of flowering plants. Now, I think there's an interaction with the climate in that mature plants, which might survive through the drought of the summer, are killed, but don't then regenerate from seed until moist conditions return in the autumn. So in effect, the weed killing is enforcing a more Mediterranean lifestyle on the species, and it's favouring winter annuals, which germinate in the autumn and flower in the spring, or those what I call opportunistic annuals, which can germinate whenever conditions are suitable and complete their life cycle within a few weeks. And it's also, of course, favouring or encouraging the evolution of herbicide resistance, which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, in this spring, the council decided not to apply the annual round of weed killer, and they also reduced mowing so that this closely cut bank, it was left to grow and had a sort of token trim round the edge, and that's all. And the result of these changes became very obvious by June in my transect. Initially, by the number of poppies that turned up, they're clearly just as vulnerable to herbicides on the street as they are in arable fields, and they were much more frequent this year. And as it was a moist summer, plants continued to grow, and by now there's a great green ribbon at the bases of the walls in the less heavily trampled streets and at the junction between the pavements and the roads. And you may have noticed when I showed the number of flowering plants I've recorded that the total this year of the number, that's the number in the species times streets, every species can occur in up to 8, or the number of species itself is considerably higher than it has been in any previous season. And perhaps more significantly for the long term, though I don't record these as they're not flowering, are the number of seedlings of woody species that are turning up, quite frequent: birches, buddleias, planes, here poplars and willows on the streets. Now, the new council policy is controversial, and looking at the internet, I can see that throughout Britain there are similar arguments raging about councils stopping weed killing. And in one street, there was a complaint, and a squad of 8 men were sent to deal with it, 3 with hose and a spade. They were very unhappy about what they had to do. They thought it was too hard work. There were 2 driving the vans with the rotary brushes. There were 2 driving vans behind them, which you can't see, to take away the stuff that they cleared. And then there was the statutory man with a clipboard overseeing proceedings. And this hasn't happened anywhere else. And the complainant must have been extremely influential. That's all I can say. But because of this sort of thing, one thing I've become aware of in visiting the streets month after month is the high turnover of species. And if you see an interesting plant that you want to photograph or identify, you have to do it straight away. There's no point procrastinating. So often it won't be there. It'll be here today and gone tomorrow. Well, I've summarized the 8 years of the transect here. Each of these numbers refers to a species, the number of streets. I've recorded it in cumulatively over the years, and the number of years. And rather crudely, there are 301 species, I should say, altogether that I've recorded. And if you crudely regard the number of streets as the frequency and the number of years as the persistence, I'd like to use this structure to try and give you an idea of my impression of the population dynamics of the species on our streets. And I'll start in the bottom right-hand corner here with the 48 species I've recorded in every year and cumulatively in 8 streets. And that includes 8 species which have been recorded in every street in every year. Now, here they are, and mainly there are what I call the opportunistic annuals, as are the near misses, the species that almost make that category. Things like groundsel chickweed, hairy bittercress, etc. But the one that really intrigues me is actually one of the few perennials, Parieteria. We haven't, I think, heard it mentioned yet this conference. I have a suspicion that it's much more frequent in Cambridge than it was just a few decades ago. Certainly if you go back to 1860, Babington's Flora, he lists 15 sites on old walls in the county, 8 churches or churchyard walls, and only 1 is in Cambridge itself. And by 1964, later Flora, it was still only occasional on old walls and buildings throughout the county. Well, it's now abundant along pavements, as well as occurring, slightly lesser extent, on old walls. And if you look at my street totals, you can see it throughout the year. Don't believe what the books tell you. They won't tell you this. And there is a little dip in the late winter. But the really cold weather we had in December 2022 really hit it back. The flowering shoots were killed. It died back either to the base or was killed completely, although it regenerated from abundant seedlings. And this strengthens my suspicion that it might have been favoured by recent milder winters. Though it's also, I suspect, herbicide resistant, although I think herbicide resistance is a really unstudied feature of the British urban flora, but it is recorded as resistant in other European countries. There isn't a great deal of support from the BSVI Atlas data for my theory that it's increasing recently, but I still think there is evidence in Cambridge that this is the case. Now, at the opposite end of my table, at the bottom row, found in 8 years, but in only 1 street, there are a group of 3 species and another group recorded, as a single colony, but in fewer years. And the best example of these, which shows the remarkable persistence of some plants to continue as small populations in the same place year after year without spreading, is Sedum album, which is confined on the transect to just 1.5 meters of wall here, and flowers every year quite happily. Unfortunately, the wall has begun to fall down, and I suspect the sedum's days are numbered, because come the reconstruction of the wall, I would think it's almost certainly going to be eliminated in repointing. And although these small populations can generally seem stable over the short term, I think they're probably, their half-life is, I suspect, rather short, as they're vulnerable to this sort of accidental extermination. This is a more surprising member of the category, Urtica membranacea, a Mediterranean annual, expanding its range in Britain, but recorded in Cambridge since 2009 as just 2 small restricted populations, one of them on the transect, and hasn't spread since then from them. There's another small group of species which are equally persistent as very small populations, but their persistence is masked because some years they don't escape from the seed bank, but they do pop up more often than not. And my best example of this is toad rush, Juncus plafonius, restricted just to the edge of one manhole cover. And I recorded it there 6 out of the 8 years. And Roripa palustris is in the same area, not quite so limited. Whereas Chenorinum reganifolium, this is just in one small stretch of pavement. I've seen this in 4 years of the 8, and none of these species are found anywhere else on the transect. They're just these small persistent populations. But these recurrent populations coming from the seed bank are not always easy to distinguish from species recur because they're repeatedly introduced from nearby parent plants cultivated nearby. And this Melica altissima actually sows itself onto the street here from my own garden, where it is here. Now, I wouldn't recommend it. It's a thuggish plant. It takes over gardens. I like to think I bought it at the instigation of my partner rather than by my own choice, but I can't honestly remember. But it can be difficult to decide whether plants are spreading directly from gardens or whether they're self-sustaining on the pavements. And I haven't a photograph of it, but Cicimbrium orientale used to be a feature of one section of the transect, just one area of path where it grew as a weed in adjacent gardens, in 1 or 2 morose derelict houses, and on the pavement. Well, the garden plants disappeared when the derelict houses were renovated, and since then the pavement population has declined to extinction nearly. And I think as a species it flowers in May and June, often at exactly the same time as the herbicide is applied, so it's very vulnerable to that. And I think in retrospect the pavement plants obviously needed topping up from the adjacent garden plants which were unsprayed the other side of the garden rails. Right, well, to return to my summary table, I'd now like to go here. 49, the highest total of all species recorded in just one street in just 1 year. And of these 49, at least 23 were present as just a single plant, probably more. I haven't been very good at keeping a record of singletons. And many of these are garden escapes. And there's an almost infinite number of species, I think, that might germinate from a garden onto the street. Not all of them are likely to survive still flowering and thus be recorded by me, but still it's potentially a very large number. And my more unusual plants include Euphorbia keratocapna, which appeared here, one plant here. This was cut down to the very base within 10 days of me finding it and recording it. Salvia microphylla is another one that appeared as a single individual, and Solanum pseudocapsicum. And I must thank here Alan Leslie, a friend in Cambridge who's done a great deal to help me identify these errant horticultural species. And if you're judging him against your apps, Michael, I think Alan would come very much higher than they do in his accuracy. This single corncockle, I suspect, came from wildflower seed, which was directly scattered on the street for some reason rather than dispersed from a cultivated plant. But I've no idea how this tiny example of the arable weed, Descurinia, came to be on its pavement. And I've no idea how this single massive hemlock came to get onto the tree base either. These are all just one species, 1 year. Some of the singletons are plants which are native elsewhere, though they may well not have been introduced to the streets from native stock. There's the lovely marshmallow, Althea. This was the first record from the Cambridge Square TL45 since the late 18th century. And then we've had this year a single Babascum thapsus. I'm pretty sure this wouldn't have escaped the herbicide regime in earlier years. These biennials are particularly vulnerable. And then on the dry street, Castle Street, Veronica catenata, although this is a street that leads down to the River Cam, so perhaps it didn't come up from the river. So far I've dealt with three groups: the common staples, the rare persisters, and the rare transients. But there are, of course, many other cases. More frequent casuals, species that tend to sow themselves out of hanging baskets around pubs or window boxes around houses, of which the most frequent in the transect is lobelia, recorded in all years, and from 6 streets in total. And I found tomatoes in 3 streets, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they're the 3 streets in which there are pubs, and we didn't have in John's mechanisms for introducing seeds into urban areas, plants introduced in human vomit, but I think it is one. Alan Leslie puts it in his Flora of Cambridgeshire rather more delicately. He talks about them being distinguished, being dispersed by regurgitated fruit. This one that I photographed is actually there, and you can see it's only a short stagger from the exit to this pub. I don't know how occasional brassicas, these just crop up from now and again with some cereals, particularly along the basis of trees. Perhaps you can help me explain what's happening there. We do have halophytes. I think these are introduced from the major roads leading into the city. Cochlea danicus, normally just the odd casual plant, but there is a small population that has begun to get established. It's lasted for 4 years now along one of the pavements. But Poxinellia distans, which we saw in the previous talk, that's nothing more than a casual in the transect, never found more than 2 years in succession on the same street. And one final category are plants that may be in the first stages of permanent colonization. And I'm pretty sure this is one, Polycarpon tetraphyllum. It's been established on Cambridge Street since 2011, but only arrived on the transect in 2021. It's now on 2 streets, and I'm pretty sure it's here to stay. And this is one I think John showed us, Polypogon montspelliensis, started off as a casual in 2019 on the transect, but it seems to be rather more slowly becoming established. Well, this discussion of longer-term change brings me to my second survey, which is a resurvey of a network of 14 streets, about the same length as the 4 kilometres streets of the transect, which was originally undertaken in 1998 and 1999 by my friend Philip Oswald in a joint study with Arthur Chater. Arthur looked at a comparable group of streets in Aberystwyth. Philip's streets are mainly in the Newtown area of Cambridge. This is the same date as Edinburgh's Newtown, but very dissimilar in character, I'm afraid. It lacks the grandeur, and it's rather more subtle in its allegiance to the Hanoverian succession. And like the transect streets I've talked to you, it has a mixture of major streets and minor streets. I haven't quite finished this resurvey this year, so I'm only dealing with some interim results. But I've put here, each number represents a species, and the number of streets Philip recorded them in here, mine here. So this 2, for instance, means 8 streets in Philip's survey and 5 in mine. Now, the first thing I think strikes me about this table is the huge number of species that were rare in both surveys. So Philip found 55 species in the streets that I've been unable to re-find. I found 110 in the streets that he didn't notice. And I think this emphasizes the tremendous turnover of the street flora. And I won't enlarge on that because I've said enough about it with respect to the transect, but it is really very striking. Whereas down here, at the bottom right, we have the sort of core species that are found, just 10 found in all streets in both surveys. What I want to do is just mention the species that have shown the greatest increase and the greatest decline, pending a more detailed analysis later. And these are the ones that show the greatest increase, ones that Philip didn't find or scarcely found, and ones which I found in over half the streets. And here they are. Some of them will be familiar to you already from earlier talks, but I think the point I'd like to make is almost all of them follow national trends. If you look at the short-term trend identified by the statistical analysis in the latest BSBI Atlas, you can see almost all of these are increasing nationally. And this is the irrigorant. We're not quite sure. Philip recorded an alien irrigorant. In 3 streets, he wasn't quite sure of the name. They were taxonomically uncertain then. And if you look at the BSBI map for sumatrensis, the pink area is the national range in 1999. You see in Cambridge we were right at the edge of that, and the red triangles are records that have been added later, and clearly it's now gone up and way past us. And I was rather pleased to be able to photograph. This is irrigorant, I hope sumatrensis, actually growing outside the house Philip lived in when he was doing the survey at 33 Panton Street. Also missing, you will have noticed Caminerian angustifolium and Senecio squalidus. Both have, oh sorry, there's one more. Increased both Poa infirma and seems to be plant of the day, Polypogum viridis. See again, it's engulfed us in its spread as an increasing species. But I was going on to talk about the ones that had declined. They're the ones that Philip found in over half the streets, but I found in either none or fewer than 4 or 5. And here they are. And it's puzzling here. They don't follow national trends anything like as clearly. There's an indication of a strong decline in Rosebay willow herb in the English records from the BSBI, and a strong decline in Oxford ragwort, but others include some increasing species, so there isn't this close tie-up with the national trend. And Rosebay it's a very striking loss. Philip had it in 12 streets, and it's clear from his notes, which he passed on to me before his death, that he'd recorded it in several sites in some of the streets. I just got 4 individuals, and I photographed 2 of them flowering and 2 of them vegetative, and that's all. And similarly, Senecio squalidus has gone, and in general in Cambridge it seems to be retreating back to its railways. But I did find, which Philip didn't, Senecio viscosus in 3 streets, and the recently arrived Senecio inaiquidens 1. And the raid groundsel, Senecio vulgaris, has also gone. Philip found it in just 1 street, but it was a feature of that street in his time, and it's missing now. Another complete disappearance, found in 13 streets in Philip's survey, and not at all in mine, is elder. And interestingly, this was one of the commonest species on walls when John Rishbeth surveyed Cambridge walls in a pioneer survey in the 1940s. But Jonathan Shanklin and we surveyed 85 walls in 2020, and it was only present on 1. So there does seem to be a genuine loss, and perhaps in the discussion people might have ideas as can help me to explain that. Other losses are equally puzzling. Tomato isn't any longer in Philip Streets, although as we've seen it is in my rather more disreputable part of Cambridge. And lobelia has declined there too. And I think the only increase I think I can explain, decrease, is male fern Dryopteris felix mass, which I think is potentially an effect of the summer droughts, which it's at the edge of its distribution in Cambridgeshire. It's often found by leaky drain pipes, and I think it may well have suffered from the summer droughts I've shown you. Well, that's coming to the end of what I wanted to say. And I'd like to step back from the sometimes sordid details of the urban flora. This is a combination of weed killing and COVID neglect, and drought, sorry, it wasn't weed, this was drought of 2022 and COVID neglect, and ask what conclusions can we draw? Well, I hope I've given you an idea of the massive flux of the urban flora, at least in this area, the relatively small core of frequent species and the transience of many of the species that you're likely to find on the streets. And superimposed on this is, of course, an element of long-term change as species expand and contract their broader ranges. Now, of course, other habitats have transient species too, and I was interested to come across a paper by Matt Sutton, who studied the plants of his Pembrokeshire farm from year after year, and he also notices these. He refers to them as the blink and you'll miss it element in his flora. But the urban areas I'm talking about, I think, are particularly likely to show such high turnover. The streets are lined by gardens. As I've said, almost anything can sow out of the gardens, but is then very vulnerable to accidental damage or deliberate persecution. So as botanists surveying the urban flora, I would say that we should remember that just as the urban streets can be noisy places, the data we collect is also likely to be full of noise too. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you very much. That was a great talk and a great piece of work. Questions?
I thoroughly enjoyed that talk, absolutely fascinating. And what I wondered was whether the fact that you're wandering these streets and people maybe get to see you month after month, it's the guy with his hand lens and his beard again, get the children inside, that kind of thing. But do you think your repeated surveying has had any effect on the way people treat the plants that are growing just outside their front gate?
No, I don't. I sometimes wonder if one or two people deliberately clear their frontages to avoid the. But I don't think that's the case. What I am subject to, I don't know if anyone of you find it, is what I call NIMBYs on the prowl. I'm always people coming are worried I'm from the council and I'm planning some sort of change to their area. And they don't seem to realise that if I was from the council, I'd be in a high-vis jacket and I wouldn't be working on a bank holiday or that sort of thing. They're so terrified that I'm planning a wind farm at the end of their street or something like that. But you do get into a lot of conversations, but I don't think they protect, and I'd be a bit worried because, of course, I wouldn't want to influence the results of what's happening.
Thank you. Michael?
We did a resurvey of the wild plants of the Glasgow Botanics a few years ago, 20 years on from a definitive study by Peter Macpherson, and that threw up the notional statistic that in a given defined area, such as your transect, the turnover or churn would be roughly between 1% and 2% per year. I haven't been able to do the maths quickly enough on your graphs, but does that seem reasonable to you?
That seems a bit low to me, but we ought to do the maths. And so the point I forgot to make, was that in the Phillips survey, we're looking at all plants, including the non-flowering ones, whereas I only look at flowering ones, and clearly the churn is going to be much greater for the vegetative ones. But I'd be very interested to do the maths and to try and work out with you how they compare. But it's about, what is it? If it's about 50 of my 300 in my transect are just in that over 8 years have just appeared once. That sounds a bit greater than 1% to 2% turnover, doesn't it? Which would be 3 to 6 a year.
A year. Additionally cumulative.
Yeah, but we ought to compare those two. Yeah.
You referred to herbicides and herbicide resistance. And it was my belief until fairly recently that most of the time the councils use glyphosate. But I did see some council workers using a grey powder And I wonder whether some councils, instead of using glyphosate, which degrades over weeks and months, whether they are beginning to use something more persistent that would last and would keep the weeds away for more than a year. Does anyone in the room even have any knowledge of what exactly are the policies of local authorities?
Before we ask other people, I just say that there was a public information request, and the council in Cambridge have said what they use. I don't remember the details, but it's characteristic in milky dots appear on the plants. They spray it as a liquid, milky, but I don't know if there are people who know more exactly.
No, I was just going to say the Pesticide Action Network have got some really good publications on pesticide use, and I think they found that, so they did an information request to every council in Britain. Not all of them replied, but those that did, I think 99% of the pesticides being used were glyphosate, but people are turning now to other alternatives, as Chris has described in his talk, with gangs of people reluctantly going out and removing vegetation, but also things like salt. People are using salt flamethrower guns as well, just to remove the actual surface vegetation. So people are coming up with other alternatives, but glyphosate is by far and away it's interesting, up in North Wales, our local town has just been sprayed a couple of months ago, relentlessly with glyphosate, and pelletry of the wall shriveled along with everything else, and I'm really interested in this. The resistance has been noted in several countries around the world with several species, but we're just not monitoring it. It'd be really useful if people could record, if a street's been herbicided, is there any evidence of species that actually survive and persist persist after that application? That'd be really useful.
It's a student project to grow progeny and look at herbicide resistance. Yeah.
I was struck by the fact that some of your photographs showed really beautifully grown plants in some places. You know, the mulleins, and I wondered is there any evidence that people are actually looking after them or even planting them?
Some people do like them, definitely, and there is a counterbalance to the headlines I've shown. There have been a couple of streets where people have invited me to help them count their plants and are determined to oppose the other people on the streets who want them cleared. I did wonder how about the poppies, whether they might be sown, and I'm pretty sure the corncockle was scattered and I forget what it was something like Anthemis or striker, but there was another signature plant of that sort of annual mix appeared in the following month. So there is a little bit of sowing going on, yes, but certainly some people love the poppies, although others think they're absolute disgrace. Yes.
David, you have your hand up.
You showed a picture of brassicas and cereals. I just wondered whether that was a birdseed mix or somebody throwing down something.
I really would like to know how that gets there, and it could be a birdseed mix, but would people put it, on the streets? It seems.
You see people throwing seeds for pigeons.
Oh, it may be if there are. Yes, yeah. I haven't actually seen that, but that does seem the more likely, explanation. Yeah.
So thank you for a lovely talk. So over the past 2 days, we've heard about the amazing biodiversity in urban areas and the wealth of information that you have. So what are the opportunities of feeding all that data to government policies on their biodiversity action plans?
I spent my career trying to avoid policy, and I think I leave that to cleverer people than I am. It was always an embarrassment to me. I never really understood what policy was, and had to pretend that I did when discussions came round to it. So I'm glad to be free of policy in retirement and just looking at the weeds.